She bought a tiny house in the harshest cold when she had no money and no hope left. People laughed at her, filmed her on their phones, and waited for her to freeze on the very first night. But when they went inside, they were left speechless. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. Lauren woke before dawn because the engine had died sometime in the night. The cold did not creep in gradually. It pounced, as if it had been crouching outside the thin metal shell of her car, waiting for the moment the last whisper of warmth surrendered. Her breath fogged the windshield in pale bursts, and she pulled her coat tighter, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulders and hips from sleeping curled like a child in the back seat. The thermometer on the dashboard blinked a number she refused to look at for long. Numbers had stopped meaning anything months ago. All that mattered was the way the cold made the world feel smaller, as if every frozen street and boarded window were pushing her toward the edge of something invisible but final. The city around her was quiet in the early hour, a northern town that had learned to accept winter as a permanent resident. Here, snow did not announce itself with charm. It arrived as a burden, a layer that accumulated until it became part of the architecture, a second skin over buildings, cars, sidewalks, even the people who walked bent against the wind. Lauren had grown up here and knew the tricks, the shortcuts between heated spaces, the way to keep moving so your blood never forgot what warmth was. Yet, none of those lessons had prepared her for living in a car in January, when even the most ordinary actions carried a risk. Turning the key too many times could drain the battery. Letting the engine idle too long could empty the tank. Sleeping too deeply could mean not waking at all. She pushed herself upright and listened to the creak of her joints, the sound sharper in the silence of the frozen street. Her phone was dead, its battery having given up sometime in the night, so she checked the time by the pale glow beginning to lift the sky. It was nearly morning. Soon the city would stir, heaters clicking on, coffee makers humming, people stepping into lives that, for them, still felt solid. For Lauren, morning meant one thing first: find warmth without drawing attention. She drove to the 24-hour laundromat on the edge of downtown, a place she had come to think of as neutral ground. The machines were always running, the doors always open, and the fluorescent lights were bright enough to wash away suspicion. She parked in her usual corner, careful to back in so the exhaust pipe would not be buried in the night's fresh snow. Inside, the air was thick with detergent and steam. She chose a washer at random, dropped in a few already clean clothes just for the excuse, and stood with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee she had bought from the vending machine. It tasted like burnt water, but it was hot, and that was enough. As the drum spun, she watched her reflection in the glass. Her face looked older than it had a year ago, the lines around her eyes sharper, her cheeks hollowed. She tried not to think about how quickly life had folded in on itself. 12 months earlier, she had still believed in plans. She had worked at a mid-size manufacturing firm, not a dream job, but a stable one, with health insurance and a supervisor who knew her name. When the company began laying people off, she told herself it would pass. When her department was cut, she told herself it was temporary. When the severance ran out, she took whatever work she could find, but it never added up to enough, bills stacked on the passenger seat of her car like accusations. The landlord was polite at first, then distant, then firm. By the time she realized she could not catch up, she was packing her life into boxes that did not fit anywhere. Her mother's illness had been the first crack, a sudden diagnosis that swallowed her savings in co-pays and prescriptions. The credit card balances climbed while Lauren worked double shifts, convinced that endurance was a solution. Then the factory closed and the ground gave way beneath her feet. Each decision afterward had felt small, even sensible at the time. Skip a payment here, delay a notice there. She had believed in the logic of survival, that if you moved quickly enough, the storm would never quite catch you. But storms do not care about logic. After the laundromat, she went to the library where the heat was reliable and nobody questioned a woman sitting quietly with a book. She read whatever was closest, not because she cared about the story, but because it kept her still long enough to thaw. By noon, the sky had darkened again, the clouds sagging low over the rooftops like something heavy pressing down. Outside, the wind sharpened, sliding through the narrow streets with a whistle that sounded like a warning. People hurried, collars turned up, their eyes skimming past her as if she were a piece of the scenery. She had learned that invisibility was the price of staying out of trouble. If you did not ask, you would not be told to leave. That afternoon, as she sat in her car trying to coax life back into her stiff fingers, the radio crackled with a voice that was too bright for the message it carried. A severe Arctic front was moving in, the announcer said, temperatures dropping to levels not seen in decades. City services were preparing, shelters would extend hours, residents were advised to stay indoors if possible. Lauren laughed quietly, a sound that came out more like a breath. Indoors was a luxury. She imagined the night ahead, the metal frame of her car turning into ice, and felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. By evening, panic began to feel like a reasonable response. She had $5 left in her wallet and less than a quarter tank of gas. The shelters would be packed, and even if she found a spot, she had seen what those places could become when too many people were pressed together in fear. There were fights over blankets, thefts in the dark, a constant tension that made sleep impossible. She had avoided them so far, preferring the solitude of her car, but solitude was starting to look like a death sentence. It was then she remembered the notice she had seen taped to a lamppost weeks earlier, a small rectangle of paper advertising a municipal auction. City surplus, the headline had said. Abandoned items, seized property, old equipment. She had dismissed it as irrelevant at the time, but now the thought clung to her. She did not need a miracle. She needed a door she could close and a space she could claim, however ridiculous it might look. The auction was the next morning. She drove there through streets that had turned into narrow corridors between banks of snow, the wind rocking her car like a toy. The building was an old warehouse near the rail yard, its windows frosted over, a banner flapping in the cold. Inside, the air smelled of rust and oil, of things that had outlived their usefulness. Rows of items were lined up with numbers taped to them. Broken office furniture, battered generators, bicycles with bent wheels, crates of parts whose purposes were long forgotten. People wandered through with clipboards, laughing, nudging each other, making plans for things Lauren could not imagine needing. She moved slowly, her breath fogging in the unheated space, her fingers numb even through her gloves. It was easy to feel out of place here, among men who looked like they came for sport, not survival. She was halfway to the exit when she saw the listing that had not been meant to catch anyone's eye. A small placard taped to a clipboard read simply, "Micro Home on Wheels." Condition unknown, entry at own risk. No photo, no description beyond that, just an inventory number scrawled in ink. She followed the arrow to the far end of the warehouse, past a row of old trailers to a shape half hidden under a tarp. When she pulled the covering back, she froze. The structure beneath was absurdly small, no taller than she was. Its sides painted a faded blue that had once tried to be cheerful. It looked less like a home than a child's plaything, something you might see in a park, not something meant to survive winter. The wheels were narrow, the hitch bent, the door hardly wider than her shoulders. She could already hear the laughter it would provoke. The bidding started low, almost as a joke. Two men near the front raised their paddles back and forth, grinning at each other, nudging the price up $1 at a time while glancing at Lauren. She felt the heat rise in her face, the old instinct to shrink, to disappear. But the memory of the cold night in her car stiffened her spine. When the auctioneer called out the next bid, she raised her hand and said a number that was almost everything she had. The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Then one of the men laughed and shook his head. He dropped out, as did the other. The auctioneer shrugged, banged the gavel, and suddenly the ridiculous little house was hers. She signed the papers at a folding table near the door, her hand trembling as she wrote her name. The clerk barely looked at her, sliding the keys across the surface with a bored motion. Lauren picked them up and turned them over in her palm, two small pieces of metal that felt heavier than they should. Outside, the wind cut through her coat as she stood staring at her purchase. She did not know how she would move it. She did not know if it would hold a breath of warmth. All she knew was that, for the first time in weeks, she was not leaving empty-handed. She found a battered bicycle in the last row of the auction, its price low enough that she could still afford it. With the help of a bored worker and a length of rope, she rigged a makeshift tow. The sight must have been comical: a woman, a tiny blue house, and a bicycle bound together like some desperate parade float. She did not care. As she began to pull, the wheels crunching through the snow, she felt a strange lightness. She was still cold, still broke, still one mistake away from disaster, but she was moving towards something that was hers, however foolish it appeared. By the time she reached the street where she planned to park, the light was fading again. Neighbors had gathered, drawn by the novelty, phones raised, laughter carried on the wind. Lauren kept her eyes on the path ahead, on the door of the micro-home that would not yet open because it was buried to the threshold in snow. She did not hear the comments clearly, only the tone, the familiar mixture of curiosity and contempt. She leaned into the rope, muscles burning, and dragged her future behind her through the gathering dark. By the time Lauren reached the narrow side street she had chosen almost at random, her hands were shaking so badly that she had to let go of the rope and rest her palms on her knees. The tiny blue structure behind her looked even smaller now that it was no longer under the cavernous roof of the warehouse. Here it was surrounded by brick apartment buildings and the skeletal branches of leafless trees, a toy stranded in a world that had never been built for it. People lingered on their porches and near their windows, pretending to shovel or smoke while they watched her struggle. She kept her head down and told herself that once the door was clear of snow, once she was inside, none of this would matter. The key turned with a brittle sound, the metal stiff from cold. She had to shoulder the door to force it open, and when she finally did, she was met with a smell that surprised her. It was not musty or damp, as she had feared, but dry, faintly metallic, as if the inside had been sealed away from the weather for a very long time. The space was barely wide enough for her to stand straight, but there was a narrow bench against one wall and a small window opposite the door. Snow had piled up against the glass outside, turning it into a glowing square of pale blue light. She closed the door and leaned back against it, listening to the muted sounds of the street, the laughter and murmurs dulled by the thickness of the walls. It was not warm, not yet, but it was not as cold as it should have been either. The difference was subtle at first, a lack of the biting edge she had come to associate with every enclosed space that was not actively heated. She waited, counting her breaths, expecting the cold to find its way in. It did not. Instead, there was a faint vibration beneath her boots, so slight she might have imagined it if she had not pressed her palm to the wall and felt the same barely perceptible hum. She laughed then, a sound half sob, half disbelief. The absurdity of the situation, of her crouched inside a house no larger than a closet, listening to something unseen breathe through its bones, was too much to hold in. She slid down until she was sitting on the floor, knees drawn up, and stayed there until the shaking in her hands eased. The first night passed in fragments. She did not sleep so much as drift, waking every hour to check that she was still alive, that the warmth she was beginning to feel had not been a trick of exhaustion. But each time she opened her eyes, the air felt the same, not comfortable exactly, but bearable. Outside, the wind screamed, rattling the buildings, and the laughter from earlier gave way to the hollow quiet that came when people retreated indoors. Lauren lay on her back on the narrow bench, staring at the ceiling so close above her that she could almost touch it, and wondered how something so small could hold off the night. Morning came gray and heavy. She pushed the door open and was met with a wall of snow, the drift higher than it had been when she arrived. She dug her way out with numb fingers, pausing to breathe, the memory of the night's warmth still wrapped around her like a fragile cocoon. On the sidewalk, someone had spray-painted a crude message beside her new home, a joke she refused to read closely. She brushed past it and went to her car to gather what little she owned, carrying boxes back one by one and stacking them carefully inside the micro home. There was barely room to turn around, but the act of arranging her belongings, of claiming the space, steadied her. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of shoveling and watching the sky. Each night, the temperature dropped further. Each morning, the city seemed to slow a little more. She began to notice things she might have missed before, like the way the walls of her new home never felt cold to the touch, no matter how long she had left the door open, or how the faint vibration she had first sensed was always there, constant and patient. Once, in a moment of curiosity, she pressed her ear to the paneling and thought she heard something like distant machinery, but when she pulled away, the sound vanished. It was on the third night, as she was clearing snow from the roof, that she found the first real anomaly. The shovel struck something solid beneath the thin outer layer of wood, a hollow clank that did not match the rest of the structure. She froze, heart racing, then scraped more carefully until a small rectangle of metal was exposed. It was flush with the wall, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, and when she ran her gloved fingers over it, she felt the faint outline of a seam. Inside, she set down the shovel and studied the panel in the dim light. It was not a vent, not a cupboard, but something else entirely, too precisely fitted to be accidental. She tried to pry it open and failed, then sat back on her heels, thinking. The inventory number from the auction surfaced in her mind, the strange abbreviation scrawled beside it. She had dismissed it as bureaucratic nonsense at the time, but now it pulsed with a different meaning. It took another hour of careful searching to find the catch, a pressure point disguised as a knot in the wood. When she pressed it, the panel slid inward with a whisper, revealing a narrow door that opened into darkness. The air that flowed out was warm, warmer than the rest of the space, and it carried with it a smell she had not noticed before, clean and sharp, like metal that had never rusted. She did not go in immediately. Instead, she closed the panel again and paced the tiny room, her thoughts colliding in her head. There was fear, of course, the primal kind that came with discovering a hidden space in a place that was supposed to be simple. But there was also something else, a pull that felt older than her caution. She had spent the last year watching her world shrink, room by room, option by option, until she was sleeping in a car. Now, inexplicably, a door had opened where none should exist. When she finally slid the panel aside again, she did so with deliberate slowness, as if the act itself required respect. The space beyond was no more than a closet, its walls lined with shelves that held folders and binders sealed in plastic. A small lamp glowed in the corner, though she could not see a switch or a wire. She picked up the nearest binder and flipped it open, her breath catching as she saw the handwriting on the first page. The name was hers, her family's, written in a hand she recognized from childhood birthday cards and long-forgotten letters. Her grandfather had been here, in this impossible room, decades ago. She sank to the floor, the binder heavy in her lap, and began to read. The words were not formal, not the language of official reports, but the intimate voice of a man writing for himself, afraid that if he did not record what he knew, it would be lost forever. He wrote of cold places and experimental shelters, of a project meant to protect people in environments where conventional heating was useless. He wrote of success that frightened his superiors, of accidents that were not accidents at all, of a final decision to hide what he could before it was taken from him. Lauren read until her eyes burned and the room outside the hidden door faded into abstraction. The hum she had noticed before seemed louder here, as if she were sitting in the heart of the house's secret. When she finally closed the binder, it was not with the relief of someone who has solved a mystery, but with the weight of someone who has just inherited a responsibility she never asked for. Outside, the sky had darkened again, the storm clouds lowering as if in response to her discovery. She stepped back into the main room and closed the panel behind her, running her fingers along the seam until it vanished. She did not know yet what she would do with what she had found. She only knew that the laughter from the street no longer sounded distant or harmless. Whatever this tiny house was, whatever her grandfather had turned it into, it was not meant to be a joke. Lauren did not sleep that night, not in any real sense of the word. She lay on the narrow bench with her grandfather's binder resting against her chest like a talisman, listening to the faint pulse within the walls. The hum had taken on a different quality since her discovery, no longer just a comforting vibration, but a reminder that something unseen was at work around her. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind scraped against the metal siding of nearby buildings, carrying with it a high, keening sound that rose and fell like a distant siren. Snow struck the tiny window in bursts, and the pale square of light dimmed until it was nothing more than a suggestion of the world beyond. She rose before dawn and slid the hidden panel open again, needing to reassure herself that the secret room had not vanished with the night. It was still there, its shelves lined with the plastic-sealed folders, its small lamp glowing with the same steady confidence it had the evening before. She touched the spines of the binders gently, as if they were fragile, though they felt solid enough. Her grandfather's handwriting appeared again and again in the margins, sometimes neat, sometimes jagged, as though he had written in a hurry, afraid of being interrupted. She wanted to read everything, to trace the story of how this impossible house had come to be, but the weight of the day pressed in on her. She could not hide forever in a room no one else knew existed. When she stepped outside to shovel, she was met with a chorus of muffled voices from behind frosted windows. Her neighbors had not forgotten her overnight. If anything, the presence of the tiny blue house had become a novelty that refused to fade. A woman across the street leaned out her door and asked if Lauren needed help, the question shaped by curiosity more than kindness. A man further down the block lifted his phone and filmed her as she struggled to clear the roof, narrating in a tone that suggested he was recording a spectacle rather than a person. She worked without responding, the shovel scraping against ice, her breath coming out in short, harsh bursts. The physical labor grounded her, but it also made her acutely aware of how exposed she was. The micro home was a bright wound in the uniform whiteness of the street, a sign that she was different, that she had failed to follow the script everyone else seemed to be living by. She imagined how she must look through their eyes, a woman who had lost everything clinging to a child's playhouse as if it were salvation. By midday, the temperature had dropped further, the air so sharp it stung her lungs. She retreated inside and closed the door, bracing herself for the cold that should have rushed in behind her. It did not come. Instead, the space filled with the same steady warmth, subtle but unmistakable. She sat on the bench and pressed her palms to the wall, feeling the gentle vibration, the almost imperceptible warmth radiating from within the structure itself. Whatever her grandfather had built, it was not a heater in any conventional sense. There was no smell of burning, no visible source of energy. It was as if the house had learned how to be warm on its own. She spent the afternoon exploring the interior, mapping its limits. Every surface was deliberate. The walls were thicker than they needed to be, the corners reinforced in a way she had never seen in recreational trailers. She found a small grill near the floor that emitted a steady flow of air, warm and dry, and when she held a scrap of paper in front of it, it fluttered in a pattern that suggested a controlled current rather than a simple draft. She tried to trace where the air came from, but found no ducts, no pipes, nothing that connected this little world to anything outside it. In the late afternoon, as the sky darkened prematurely, the first messages began to appear online. Someone had posted a short video of her from the previous day, her figure bent against the rope, the tiny house bumping along behind her. The caption was flippant, a joke about madness in the cold. She scrolled through the comments with a hollow feeling in her chest. People she had never met speculated about her life with the confidence of strangers who believe they understand a story after hearing a single line. Some were cruel, others merely dismissive, but none of them were curious in the way that mattered. She closed her phone and set it aside. The laughter of the streets was easier to bear when it was reduced to sound, stripped of the faces that had produced it. But even without the screen, she could feel the weight of it pressing in. Every time someone passed her window, every time a voice rose in the cold outside, it reinforced the sense that she was being watched, evaluated, found wanting. That evening, the snow deepened, blanketing the street until the sidewalks vanished entirely. The laughter faded as people retreated indoors, leaving behind a silence that felt more threatening than any insult. Lauren sat on her bench and read more of her grandfather's journal by the light of the hidden lamp, the words unfolding a history that was at once intimate and vast. He wrote of research stations buried in ice, of prototypes tested in conditions so extreme that ordinary equipment failed within hours. He described a breakthrough that allowed heat to be generated not by burning fuel, but by manipulating the structure of materials themselves, coaxing warmth out of molecular movement in a way that seemed almost like magic. She paused over a passage where he mentioned an inventory number that matched the one on her auction paperwork. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. He had hidden this house in plain sight, disguised as surplus, trusting that the system he had worked within would be too rigid, too blind to ever look closely at what it was discarding. And now it had found its way to her, not through planning, but through desperation. The power flickered just before midnight. Lauren noticed it only because the hum within the walls changed pitch for a fraction of a second, a soft stutter that made her sit up straight. Outside, lights winked out along the block, windows turning dark one by one. She opened the door a crack and looked down the street. The familiar glow that usually seeped from behind curtains was gone, replaced by a darkness that felt heavier than the storm clouds above it. Somewhere, a car alarm wailed and then cut off abruptly. She closed the door again and leaned against it, the realization settling over her like another layer of cold. The city was losing its grip on the storm. What she had thought of as a personal crisis was unfolding into something much larger, something that would not care whether her neighbors had laughed at her or not. The warmth inside her tiny house felt suddenly fragile, not because it was failing, but because it was alone. As the hours passed, she heard muffled sounds from outside that she could not place at first. Footsteps crunching through deep snow, voices raised in confusion, a door slamming somewhere nearby. She did not move from her seat, listening, waiting for the cold to test her new refuge the way it was testing everything else. It did not. The air inside remained steady, the hidden systems humming with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. At some point in the early morning, a shadow fell across her window. She froze, heart pounding, then heard a tentative knock, the sound barely audible through the thick door. For a moment, she did nothing, caught between the instinct to protect what she had found and the knowledge that someone out there was cold, perhaps as cold as she had been only days ago. The laughter of the streets had not prepared her for this, for the possibility that the joke had become a lifeline. She rose slowly and crossed the tiny space, her hand hovering over the latch. Outside, the storm howled, the world beyond her door shrinking to whatever was brave or desperate enough to seek her out. Lauren stood with her hand on the latch for several long seconds before she finally opened the door. The figure outside was a woman from across the street, someone Lauren had seen often but never spoken to, bundled so deeply in scarves and hats that only her eyes were visible. They were red from cold and fear. She did not ask for permission. She did not apologize for the months of glances that had carried judgment. She simply said that her apartment was freezing, that the radiators had gone silent, that she had tried to keep warm with the oven, but the gas had cut off too. Her voice shook so badly it barely carried across the small space. Lauren stepped aside and let her in. The woman hesitated on the threshold, her shoulders hunching as if she expected a trick, and then she crossed into the micro-home and stopped dead. The warmth hit her like a physical presence. She closed her eyes and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, the kind of noise people make when they are finally safe enough to stop pretending they are not afraid. Lauren watched her with a mixture of relief and terror. She had opened the door once. She did not know how to close it again. They sat on the narrow bench together, knees touching, the silence between them filled with the low hum Lauren had begun to think of as the house's heartbeat. The woman introduced herself as Claire and told her, in broken sentences, about the night her pipes had frozen, the way the walls of her apartment had begun to weep with condensation that then turned to ice, about how she had tried to sleep in her winter coat until the cold woke her in waves of pain. She had noticed the light in Lauren's window, the impossible little square of brightness in a dark street, and had followed it like a signal flare. When Claire left an hour later, she did so reluctantly, promising to return with blankets for others who might need them. Lauren closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her mind racing. The secret room behind the panel felt heavier now, as if the binders she had read were not just history, but instruction. Her grandfather had not hidden this technology so it could keep a single person warm. He had hidden it because he had believed in something more stubborn than fear. She opened the panel again and stepped into the hidden space, the warmth inside more intense than in the main room. She pulled out another binder and skimmed until she found a section marked with diagrams of the micro-home's internal structure. The drawings were precise, annotated in the same familiar hand. They showed layers within the walls, channels for air, and something else that was not labeled in any way she recognized. There were notes in the margins about load limits, about the balance between thermal generation and structural integrity, about how many bodies the system could safely sustain before it began to destabilize. Lauren closed her eyes and pictured the street outside, the darkened windows, the neighbors huddled in their apartments or wandering the snow in search of warmth. The laughter she had endured for days seemed impossibly distant now. This was not about pride anymore, not about proving anyone wrong. It was about whether she could live with herself if she stayed silent. The next knock came less than 20 minutes later, and then another. By the time the first hint of dawn colored the sky, there were 5 people inside her tiny house, sitting on the floor, leaning against the walls, their breath no longer visible in the air. Among them was a man with a young daughter, wrapped in a coat too big for her, her small hands curled around a chipped mug of tea Claire had brought back from her apartment. The girl stared at Lauren with solemn eyes, as if trying to understand why this place felt different from every other place she had been that night. Lauren organized them instinctively, moving boxes out of the way, spreading blankets, showing them where to sit so they would not block the vents she was only beginning to understand. She kept one eye on the hidden panel, on the binders that might tell her when she had reached the limit of what the house could endure. The hum in the walls deepened, barely noticeable unless you were listening for it, like a breath drawn a little too sharply. As the morning wore on, the city's failure became impossible to ignore. Phones lost signal. The radio stations that had continued broadcasting through the night fell silent one by one. Lauren turned on the small terminal she had discovered tucked behind a cupboard, its screen flickering to life with a dull green glow. Her grandfather's notes had mentioned an emergency communications system that operated on frequencies abandoned decades earlier, a last resort designed for situations exactly like this. She did not know if it would work, but when she pressed the worn buttons, a burst of static filled the room, followed by a voice so distorted it might have been a ghost. She spoke into the microphone without thinking, given her name, her street, the number of people she had with her. There was a pause that stretched into panic, and then the voice returned, clearer this time, asking her to repeat. By the third exchange, she realized she was not the only one using this channel. Fragments of other calls bled through the static, desperate coordinates, names, pleas for help from parts of the city she had never visited, but could picture all too clearly. The hidden room had become her refuge, but now it was also her command center. She moved back and forth between it and the main space, checking the diagrams, watching the faces of the people she had taken in. She told them what she could, leaving out the parts that would only frighten them. She did not mention her grandfather or the fact that this technology was not supposed to exist. She only said that they were safe for now. By afternoon, the street outside was unrecognizable, transformed into a white canyon between dark buildings. A pair of firefighters arrived on foot, their gear crusted with ice, their faces raw. They had followed a faint signal on an old receiver, a piece of equipment one of them had found in a storage room months earlier and never bothered to throw away. When they stepped inside the micro home, their expressions mirrored Claire's, shock giving way to relief so profound it looked like exhaustion. They asked questions Lauren could not yet answer. How was this possible? How many people could she shelter? How long would it last? She showed them the binders, the diagrams, the careful notes in her grandfather's hand, and watched their skepticism turn into something like reverence. They promised to relay her location to anyone still listening, to send people her way if they could reach them. That night, as the temperature dropped again and the city around her sank deeper into darkness, Lauren stood in the hidden room and traced the lines of her grandfather's sketches with her finger. The secret he had buried had not been meant to save a family's pride or to gather dust in forgotten binders. It had been meant for this, for a moment when laughter would no longer be a shield and survival would depend on the courage to open a door. By the time the second night fell, after Lauren had first opened her door to the street, the city had become something she barely recognized. It was not only the absence of light or the silence of the radio stations that unsettled her. It was the way the usual rhythms of life had been erased, as if someone had reached down and turned the entire place a few notches closer to stillness. Streets that had once carried the steady pulse of traffic now lay empty beneath thick layers of snow. The tire tracks that marked hurried escapes already filled in by the storm. Apartment buildings stood like dark cliffs, their windows black, their interiors sealed off from one another by cold, so intense it felt almost solid. Inside the micro home, time moved differently. The air remained warm, steady, immune to the creeping failure outside. Yet the weight of what was happening pressed in through the walls in ways heat could not repel. The people Lauren had taken in shifted restlessly, their initial relief giving way to the deeper anxiety that came when they realized the crisis was not a brief interruption, but a collapse of the systems they had trusted without thinking. Claire paced the narrow floor, murmuring about her elderly neighbor who had refused to leave her apartment. The man with the little girl kept checking the door as if expecting it to burst inward at any moment. Lauren moved among them, offering what comfort she could, though her own nerves were stretched so tight she felt as if a single unexpected sound might snap them. She returned again and again to the hidden room, studying her grandfather's diagrams, trying to reconcile the abstract lines on paper with the living, breathing people who now depended on the house's hidden heart. The notes warned about thresholds, about the balance between thermal generation and structural endurance. She did not know how close she was to those limits, only that each new knock on the door carried with it both a promise and a threat. The emergency terminal crackled sporadically, voices breaking through the static in fragments that painted a grim picture of the wider city. A hospital wing without power. An apartment block where the upper floors had already frozen solid. A bus stranded on an overpass, its passengers wrapped in whatever they had found. The firefighters who had first reached her returned briefly with news that their trucks could no longer navigate the streets, the diesel engines refusing to turn over in the cold. They had turned to foot patrols, moving in small teams, following the faint lifelines of outdated radios and rumors of warmth. Lauren found herself giving directions she had never learned, guiding strangers through neighborhoods she had only ever passed through in summer. She did not think about the danger of broadcasting her location so openly. Not yet. The urgency of the voices on the other end of the line stripped away caution. When a woman cried that her husband had collapsed in their unheated bedroom and she did not know how to lift him, Lauren's answer came automatically. A sequence of instructions she did not remember learning, drawn perhaps from some half-forgotten first aid course, or simply from the stubborn will to keep someone else alive. As the night deepened, the micro home grew crowded. People arrived in clusters, led by firefighters or neighbors who had heard whispers of a place where the cold did not rule. Lauren greeted them at the door, her face numb not just from the temperature outside, but from the constant emotional recalibration required to meet each new story. Some were angry, demanding to know why she had warmth when they did not. Others were too exhausted to speak, collapsing onto the floor with a gratitude that bordered on disbelief. The hum within the walls deepened as more bodies filled the space. Lauren noticed the subtle changes first, the way the warmth seemed to concentrate near the vents, the way the vibration beneath her feet became more pronounced. She returned to the hidden room and traced the warning symbols in her grandfather's notes with a finger that trembled despite the heat. The house was not infinite. It had been designed for emergencies, not for the sustained burden of a city in collapse. At some point before dawn, a man in a heavy coat pushed his way through the small crowd at the door, his voice loud with authority that no longer held any power outside the room. He identified himself as a municipal official, demanding to know on whose authorization Lauren was operating what he called a private shelter. The word private landed between them like an accusation. Lauren looked at him and saw not malice but fear, the same fear that had driven everyone else here, shaped differently by years of habit. He spoke of liability, of safety codes, of the need to transfer control to the appropriate departments. She heard all of it and thought of her grandfather's cramped handwriting, the lines he had written about people who were more afraid of losing control than of losing lives. She did not raise her voice. She simply showed him the binder she had been carrying back and forth, the diagrams that no one in City Hall would recognize, the notes about experimental systems abandoned before their time. She told him, quietly, that she would not close the door on people who were freezing, that if he wanted to take responsibility, he was welcome to stay and help. The man looked around at the children huddled against their parents, at the firefighters who had sunk to the floor in exhaustion, and something in his posture shifted. He removed his hat and held it in his hands like a schoolboy who had forgotten a lesson. By the time the first hint of morning light filtered through the snow, Lauren had lost track of how many people had passed through her door. Some stayed only long enough to warm up before moving on, carrying with them scraps of hope that they spread further into the frozen maze of streets. Others remained, too weak or too frightened to venture back out. The house had become a crossroads, a living node in a network of desperation that stretched far beyond its tiny walls. She caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror near the door and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were ringed with dark circles, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat despite the storm outside. She looked older than she had the day before, worn by decisions she had never imagined making. Yet, beneath the fatigue, there was a steadiness she had not felt in years, a sense that she was no longer simply reacting to the collapse around her, but shaping, in her own small way, how it unfolded. The city beyond her door continued to darken, its failures compounding with each passing hour. But inside the micro home, warmth held, voices rose and fell in cautious conversation, and the hum within the walls beat on, defiant. Lauren stood in the center of it all, the last person anyone would have expected to anchor such a fragile refuge, and realized that the laughter that had once followed her down the street had been replaced by something far heavier. The cold had stripped the city of its illusions, and in doing so, it had given her a role she could not abandon, even if she wanted to. The third day of the blackout began without ceremony, as if the city no longer possessed the strength to announce its own suffering. Lauren measured time now not by clocks or the slow brightening of the sky, but by the rhythm of people arriving and leaving her door. Every few minutes there was another knock, another face hollowed by cold, another story that blurred into all the others until she could no longer separate them in her mind. She existed in a state of constant motion, passing cups of warm water, guiding bodies towards the vents that breathed out the house's impossible heat, whispering reassurances she was no longer certain she believed. The micro-home had become something else entirely, its original absurdity stripped away by necessity. Children lay curled in piles of coats near the floor where the warmth was strongest. Adults leaned against the walls, their eyes closed not in sleep, but in a careful hovering between alertness and collapse. The firefighters who had found her first now moved with a purpose that cut through the room's chaos, organizing those who could still walk into small groups that would venture out in search of others, guided by the emergency frequencies Lauren relayed to them from the hidden terminal. She spent as much time in the secret room as she did among the people, flipping through her grandfather's notes until the words blurred. He had written about thresholds not as numbers, but as sensations, signs that the system was straining, a change in pitch, a warmth that gathered in one place instead of spreading evenly, a vibration that became more insistent, as if the house were trying to speak. Lauren felt those warnings now in her bones. The hum had deepened again, a constant pressure that made the soles of her feet tingle even when she stood still. Late in the morning, as a group of rescuers prepared to leave, the emergency terminal flared with a sudden clarity that made everyone in the room fall silent. The static thinned to reveal a coordinated call from what remained of the city's Central Emergency Command, their voices strained but unmistakably authoritative. They wanted her location confirmed. They wanted to know how she was maintaining power. They spoke of deploying resources, of consolidating operations. In the clipped cadence of crisis management, Lauren heard the same underlying assumption she had encountered the night before, that whatever was happening inside her tiny house was no longer hers. When the first official arrived shortly thereafter, his boots leaving puddles on the floor that steamed faintly in the warmth, Lauren was ready for him. He carried a clipboard as if it were armor, and he spoke with the practiced detachment of someone used to being obeyed. He praised her initiative while simultaneously outlining the risks, the need for oversight, the protocols that had been suspended only temporarily. He said that the micro-home would need to be transferred to a more suitable location, integrated into a larger response plan. Lauren listened until he ran out of words. Then she asked him to step into the hidden room with her. The binders lay open on the small shelf, the diagrams spread like a map of her grandfather's long-buried defiance. She pointed out the sections that described the system's fragility, the notes about load balancing and the dangers of abrupt disconnection. She told him, as calmly as she could, that if he moved the house without understanding what it was, he might kill everyone inside it, including himself. The official's face changed as he read, the lines of authority giving way to the expression of someone who had stumbled into a story he was not prepared to tell. He asked about the man who had written the notes, about how Lauren had come to possess them. She gave him only what was necessary, that her grandfather had built this as a proof of concept, that he had hidden it because the system that employed him had not wanted proof. When the official suggested that the technology belonged to the city, to the public, she met his eyes and said that it belonged to the people who were freezing outside, and that if he wanted to help them, he should put down the clipboard and start carrying blankets. The confrontation did not end with a neat resolution. There were arguments beyond the walls of the micro home, conversations Lauren could not hear but felt reverberate through the house in the form of footsteps and raised voices outside. For a moment, she feared the worst, that someone would force the door, that her grandfather's secret would be claimed by hands that did not know how to hold it. But when she returned to the main room, she found the official sitting on the floor beside the man with the little girl, his clipboard set aside, his jacket open to the warmth. He did not look at Lauren, but she understood that a line had been crossed, not by her, but by the circumstances that had rendered old hierarchies irrelevant. The crisis within the micro home peaked that afternoon. The house had taken in more people than Lauren ever imagined possible, and the signs her grandfather had warned of were no longer subtle. The warmth was uneven, pooling near the vents while the far corners cooled. The hum had become a low growl that made conversation difficult. Lauren felt a sharp pang of fear, a recognition that her defiance might be pushing the system past its limits. She retreated to the hidden room, heart hammering, and searched the binders for anything she had missed. There, buried in a section she had skimmed too quickly before, was a description of a secondary operational mode, a way to shift the house into a state of reduced output that would preserve its core function at the cost of comfort. The language was cautious, the warnings clear. This was not meant to be used lightly. It would buy time, not solve the problem. She explained what she intended to do to the people gathered in the main room, choosing her words carefully so as not to panic them. She said the house needed to rest, that the warmth would fade a little but not disappear, that they would need to make room for others to pass through rather than staying indefinitely. There were protests, of course, fear rising in voices that had already spent days in terror, but there was also understanding, a fragile trust that had grown in the absence of any better options. With the help of the firefighters, Lauren guided small groups out into the storm, pointing them towards nearby shelters that had managed to restore partial heat, or toward buildings that had been evacuated and could be reached safely. Each departure felt like a gamble, a risk she had no choice but to take. When the room was less crowded, she returned to the hidden panel and followed the instructions in her grandfather's hand, pressing a sequence of concealed switches she had never noticed before. The change was immediate and unmistakable. The hum softened, dropping to a gentler vibration that settled into the bones of the house like a sigh. The warmth retreated from its sharp edges, becoming a more diffuse presence that no longer fought the cold so aggressively. People shivered, pulling their coats closer, but they did not freeze. Lauren watched the system stabilize on the diagram she had memorized, the indicators aligning with the safe margins her grandfather had outlined. By the time night fell again, the city beyond the micro home had begun, haltingly, to respond. Convoys of emergency vehicles crept through the streets, their lights reflected in the ice like scattered stars. The radio carried more voices now, coordination replacing confusion, though the exhaustion beneath it was impossible to hide. Lauren stood in the doorway of her tiny house and watched a group of evacuees disappear down the block under the guidance of rescuers, their silhouettes swallowed by the storm. She did not feel triumphant. She felt emptied out, as if the house had not been the only thing forced to shift into a reduced mode, But when she turned back inside and met the eyes of those who remained, she understood that whatever happened next, whatever battles awaited her with officials and bureaucrats and the ghosts of a buried past, the micro-home had already fulfilled its purpose. It had saved lives not by being perfect, but by enduring just long enough for people to endure with it. When the storm finally loosened its grip on the city, it did not do so with the drama people expected. There was no sudden break in the clouds, no triumphant shaft of sunlight cutting through the gray. Instead, the cold retreated like a tide, inch by stubborn inch, leaving behind a landscape that looked less like a town and more like the fossil of one. Ice still crusted the stairwells and fire escapes. Windows were filmed with opaque frost, and the streets were scarred by deep grooves where rescue vehicles had fought their way through. The blackout did not end all at once either. Power returned in pockets, a single block lighting up while the buildings beside it remained dark, as if the city were relearning how to breathe one lungful at a time. Lauren stood in the doorway of the micro-home and watched the slow resurrection with a feeling she could not name. It was not relief, not quite, because relief implied that what had happened was now over, safely confined to the past. What she felt instead was an echo, a lingering pressure behind the ribs that told her the cold had changed something fundamental. People would talk about this winter for years, about the night the city almost froze to death, about the buildings that had been evacuated too late, about the names that would be read out at memorials. But Lauren knew that the real story would live in quieter places, in the way people hesitated before trusting infrastructure again, in the way they glanced at radiators and power lines as if they were less permanent than they had once believed. The micro-home had become a landmark without ever meaning to. Reporters arrived in cautious clusters, their boots slipping on the packed snow, their cameras held close to their chests as if the little blue structure might vanish if they looked at it too directly. They asked Lauren the same questions again and again. How had she come to live there? How had she kept it running? Did she consider herself a hero? She answered as honestly as she could, which was to say that she spoke of her grandfather, of his work and his stubborn refusal to let it die, of the people who had filled the room when there was nowhere else to go. She did not use words like miracle or destiny, because she had learned too well how easily those words could be stripped of their meaning. The city officials were less patient. Within days of the power returning, she was summoned to meetings in rooms that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, where men and women who had not shivered once during the storm leaned forward across polished tables and spoke of liability and ownership. They told her that the micro-home represented a technology of immense value, that it could not remain in private hands, that there were procedures to follow. Lauren listened, her hands folded in her lap, and thought of the night she had opened her door to Claire, of the sound that had escaped the woman's throat when the warmth wrapped around her. She had not saved binders or diagrams. She had saved people. That distinction mattered to her more than any legal argument. The documents she carried with her into those rooms were not official, but they were relentless. Her grandfather's journals, the annotated schematics, the inventory numbers that linked the micro-home to a project that had been buried rather than concluded. She laid them out with a care that surprised even her fingers tracing the lines of his handwriting as if he were in the room with her. She told them about the accident on the northern base, about the pressure to sign away the truth, about the way he had hidden his last prototype not out of greed, but out of fear that the work would be erased entirely. She did not accuse. She simply refused to pretend that history could be rearranged for convenience. public opinion shifted in ways she could not have predicted. The same videos that had once mocked her now resurfaced with new captions, the laughter they contained transformed into something closer to shame. People left notes on the door of the micro-home thanking her for opening it when it mattered. Others brought food, blankets, things she no longer needed but accepted anyway because the giving was as important as the receiving. A lawyer who had spent 2 nights on her floor offered his services without charge, poring over her grandfather's papers and explaining the language of ownership in terms that made sense to someone who had lost so much already. The city announced an inquiry into the cold response, into why the infrastructure had failed so completely, into what had become of the research programs that might have prevented such a collapse. Lauren was called to testify, her voice echoing in a chamber where officials shifted in their seats and avoided one another's eyes. She spoke of her grandfather as a man, not a footnote, of the way his work had been reduced to a rumor and a storage unit until a woman with $5 and a bicycle had stumbled upon it. She did not ask for restitution or recognition. She asked only that his name be restored to the record, that the technology he had believed in be studied rather than sequestered, that it not be lost a second time. The day the city issued its formal apology to the families of those who had died, Lauren stood at the edge of the crowd and held Claire's hand. The little girl, who had first arrived in her house wrapped in a borrowed coat, stood between them, her fingers tangled in Lauren's scarf. Names were read aloud, the sound carrying over the square like a fragile bridge between the living and the absent. Lauren closed her eyes and imagined her grandfather in the secret room, bending over his diagrams with the same care she now brought to every decision. She wished she could tell him that his work had not ended in silence after all. In the weeks that followed, the micro-home became the subject of studies and proposals, its systems examined by engineers who spoke in cautious tones about possibilities and challenges. Lauren watched them work from the doorway, careful to ensure that the house was never treated as a curiosity alone. She had agreed to let them analyze the technology on one condition, that the structure itself remain where it was for the time being, a living reminder rather than a relic. The city balked at first, then relented under the weight of public pressure and the inconvenient fact that there was no clear precedent for seizing a miracle from the person who had used it to keep others alive. Her own life changed in ways that felt both sudden and long overdue. The same council that had debated her right to the micro-home approved a grant for a pilot program based on her grandfather's designs, small autonomous shelters intended not for prestige, but for those who had nowhere else to go. Lauren was asked to advise, a word that made her laugh quietly when she first heard it. She had no formal training in engineering or policy. What she had was the memory of cold that burned like a brand, and the conviction that no one should have to learn those lessons in the dark. On a clear evening in early spring, when the snow had begun at last to retreat from the sidewalks, Lauren returned to the micro-home alone. The crowd had thinned, the reporters gone in search of the next story, the officials absorbed back into their committees and task forces. She opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar warmth greeting her like an old friend. The hum within the walls was softer now, the system still in its reduced mode, resting after the labor it had endured. She sat on the bench and let the silence settle around her, not the silence of abandonment, but of a place that had finished speaking and was waiting to be heard again. There was a knock at the door, hesitant and light. She opened it to find a man about her age. A duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his eyes wary in the way she recognized too well. He did not tell her his story right away. He simply said that someone at the temporary housing center had mentioned a little blue house on this street, a place where people were treated as more than a problem to be solved. Lauren stepped aside and let him in without asking anything further. As he crossed the threshold, she caught her reflection in the small mirror near the door. The woman, looking back at her, was still tired, still carrying the marks of the winter that had nearly broken the city. But there was something else there, too, a steadiness that had not come from surviving alone in a car or from enduring laughter. It had come from opening a door when closing it would have been easier, from turning a secret into a shelter, from choosing to believe that warmth, once discovered, was meant to be shared. She closed the door behind the man and leaned against it, the hum of the house rising to meet her as it always did. Outside, the city went on rebuilding itself in fits and starts, uncertain of its own resilience. Inside, the micro-home waited, patient as ever, holding space for whoever might need it next. A small, stubborn proof that even in the coldest places, someone could decide to keep the light on. If this story kept you watching until the very end, make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss what happens next. New stories are coming, and some of them are even more shocking than this one. Share this video with someone who loves real survival stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.